is easy to think of the Middle Ages and images drawn from paintings, illuminated manuscripts, or the staged pageantry of historical reenactments. Gleaming suits of armor, soaring cathedrals, and banquet tables heavy with roasted meats, these are the symbols that come most readily to mind. Yet beneath the romance, beneath the chivalric ideals, and the flicker of candlelight in stone halls, there lay a quieter, more universal truth about medieval life. Every man, woman, and child still had to tend to the same most human of needs. Today, we take for granted the easy reach for a roll of soft, processed paper in the privacy of a modern bathroom. The act is nearly invisible in our routines, an afterthought to comfort and hygiene. But in the centuries between the collapse of Rome and the dawn of the Renaissance, there was no such commonplace convenience. For the vast majority of Europe's population, there was not only no toilet paper, there were no toilets as we know them at all. The absence was not a minor matter. It shaped habits, determined architecture, influenced trade, and carried within it a quiet but constant reminder of the earthier side of life. The medieval world did not lack for ingenuity in this matter. It simply lacked uniformity. The means by which people cleaned themselves after relieving nature's call depended on where they lived, what resources surrounded them, and how much wealth they possessed. Geography dictated many of the possibilities. In the coastal towns of the North Sea, smooth, rounded seashells could be plucked from the shore conveniently shaped and endlessly renewable. In the forests of Germany or France, moss might be gathered, damp and pliant, offering a soft and absorbent alternative. In the drier regions of southern Europe, stalks of plants and handfuls of straw served the same purpose, scratchy though they might be. Wealth and rank also played their role. A nobleman or a wealthy merchant might have access to strips of fine linen or remnants of cloth too worn to sew into garments. The poor, meanwhile, made do with whatever came to hand often literally. A smooth river stone, wiped clean and kept for repeated use, was not uncommon in rural villages. In certain monastic communities, scraps of parchment too worn to hold ink might be repurposed, though this was rare and usually born from necessity rather than comfort. The choices, however varied, spoke to a culture in which nothing was truly wasted and every material found a second or even third life before being discarded. One must remember that privacy, in the modern sense, was a rare luxury. In castles, the garderobe little more than a protruding stone chamber with a hole leading to the outside offered a semblance of seclusion, though not much in the way of sanitation. In rural homes, a designated spot in the woods or a pit dug away from the main dwelling might serve. The cleaning material, whether moss or rag or handful of straw, would be kept nearby, often in baskets, sometimes dampened for comfort. In cities, where space was limited and waste disposal was a constant challenge, the cleaning might be done hastily, sometimes with nothing more than water, and the refuse tossed into gutters or cesspits. Cultural attitudes toward cleanliness were also distinct from ours. Medieval Europeans did not measure hygiene by daily baths or antibacterial routines. For many, the idea of washing after relieving oneself was unfamiliar. The act of wiping was sufficient, and the tools for doing so were chosen more for their availability than their sanitary quality. In wealthier households, perfumed cloths might be kept to mask unpleasant odors. But in poorer dwellings, there was little effort to disguise the realities of bodily functions. This was not considered crude, it was simply life. The absence of toilet paper did not mean the absence of concern for health, however. Medieval physicians and herbalists, drawing on classical texts from Galen and Hippocrates, occasionally recommended particular materials for cleaning after defecation, believing them to protect against disease. Smooth, clean cloths were preferred, while rough or splintered materials were discouraged for fear of causing injury. In some cases, herbal ointments were applied afterward, particularly in monasteries or noble households where such remedies were easier to prepare. One can almost imagine a winter's day in a timber-framed farmhouse, the hearth burning low, the wind pressing through gaps in the shutters, and a family member stepping outside to the latrine pit, clutching a bundle of straw in one hand. In such moments, the act was neither dramatic nor shameful. It was simply another chore in a day filled with labor, like drawing water from the well or feeding the chickens. Yet for us, centuries later, it is a detail that strips away the romantic varnish we often paint upon the medieval world. It forces us to see those long-ago people not as distant figures in costume, but as human beings with the same needs, improvisations, and small discomforts we know today. This unglamorous reality, more than any tale of knights or kings, ties us to them. For while the tools may change, the need does not. What they reached for in those moments was determined by the season, by the land, by the measure of their fortunes, but always, in the end, by necessity. It is here, in the humble act of cleaning oneself without toilet paper, that the daily life of medieval people reveals itself most plainly, practical, resourceful, and unafraid of the truths that polite society so often hides away. To those of us who grew up in the 20th century, it's hard to imagine life without toilet paper. The flushable kind is practically synonymous with the modern age. But before mass-produced wood pulp took over, our ancestors had other tools at their disposal, or rather something they used instead of disposable paper, long before paper became the universal tool of personal hygiene. The element most relied upon for cleansing the body was water. To a medieval mind, especially one shaped by the traditions of the classical world or the influence of the East, water was not merely a cleansing agent, a living resource that could purify in ways cloth and straw could not. And so in many corners of medieval Europe, the absence of toilet paper did not inspire panic. Instead, it simply meant turning to what rivers, wells, and rain offered freely. Yet the use of water for such purposes was far from a private matter. In bustling towns, particularly in southern Europe, where the Mediterranean climate made fresh water more abundant and its use in hygiene more ingrained, it was not uncommon for communal latrines to be built near water sources. These were not the clean, tiled facilities of the modern era, but stone or timber structures often perched above flowing channels, where the current would carry away the waste. Cleaning oneself afterward could involve dipping claws, handfuls of moss, or the bare hand directly into the water. In some cases, a small jug was kept nearby, allowing the user to pour a cleansing stream. Among seafaring communities, a different solution arose. Sailors, often days or weeks at sea, had little access to soft materials. A bucket of seawater became the answer. Rough on the skin, salty to the point of sting, yet effective in its own way, this was the sailor's reality. Sometimes a rope with frayed ends, the infamous Sailor S rope, or tow rag, was trailed in the water alongside the ship, cleaned by the waves and reused by multiple crew members. To modern sensibilities, the thought borders on the unthinkable. To them, it was simply part of shipboard life. The Romans, whose infrastructure and habits influenced much of medieval Europe, had relied on a tool called the tersorium, a sponge attached to the end of a stick, dipped in a bucket of water or vinegar solution between uses. This tradition lingered in certain places well into the medieval period, particularly in monastic communities and in the remnants of urban centers that still clung to ancient customs. The sponge stick was practical, reusable, and when vinegar was employed, marginally disinfecting. But its communal nature meant that sanitation was largely a matter of faith, not science. In monasteries, where shared life was central to the rule, water-based cleaning often took on a ritualistic dimension. A monk might leave the cloister, pass quietly through the cloaca, a latrine chamber, usually set above a running channel, and clean himself in the prescribed manner before returning to prayer or labor. Privacy was minimal, but within the walls such acts were not shrouded in embarrassment. They were part of the rhythm of daily life, as ordinary as kneeling in the chapel or tending the garden. In cities, however, the use of water for cleansing could bring challenges. Fresh water was precious, and wastewater disposal was a constant problem. Those who lived near rivers might rely on them for washing, both for the body and for the objects used to clean the body. But rivers were also the dumping grounds for refuse, tannery byproducts, and human waste itself. The result was a paradox. The same waters that cleansed might also carry sickness. Medieval people knew this in a vague sense. They spoke of bad airs and foul vapors, but lacking germ theory, they continued to use the waters out of necessity. In wealthier households, the use of water for post-relief cleaning could be more refined. A basin and ewer might be brought to the latrine or chamber pot, and fine linen cloths dipped and wrung for gentle cleansing. Some even scented the water with rose petals, lavender, or mint, turning the act into a small moment of comfort. In noble courts influenced by the Islamic world, particularly in Spain and Sicily water-based, cleansing methods were refined into elaborate routines, complete with specially designed vessels called loda or ibrik, made of brass or ceramic, whose long spouts allowed for a steady and controlled stream. And thus, throughout the Middle Ages, despite the absence of paper, the need for cleanliness was met. Rivers, buckets, sponges, and faithful servants bore witness to countless rituals of cleansing, each a testament to the tenacity of human needs and the resourcefulness of medieval life. In a time before disposable convenience, necessity was the mother of invention, and no solution was too humble or too public for the simple act of cleaning oneself. From the humblest peasant to the highest lord, all were united in their need for water and the quiet dignity of personal hygiene. Thank you for watching. When you think of medieval toilets, your mind probably conjures up images of people using shared wooden seats in communal latrines, or even just using the corner of a room or the street outside their house. But in the privacy of their own homes, people did what they could to make things more comfortable, and that included using whatever they had handy as toilet paper. Now, when we think of toilet paper, we tend to assume that it's something completely separate from nature. It comes from trees, sure, but the process of turning wood pulp into soft, white squares is so manufactured that we don't really associate it with the raw materials. But in an age before paper mills dotted the countryside, before linen rags could be turned into cheap sheets for printing or wrapping, the most immediate and abundant alternative to toilet paper was what grew all around: leaves, grasses, and herbs. The medieval world, rooted so deeply in the rhythms of the natural seasons, leaned upon the bounty of the land not only for food, shelter, and medicine, but also for the most intimate of daily necessities. The choice of plant material was not random. Medieval people, bound to the land through farming, foraging, and careful observation, knew which leaves were soft and pliant, which were broad enough to be useful, and which were to be avoided at all costs. In spring and summer, when the woods and hedgerows were thick with green, one might reach for the broad leaves of burdock or the smooth, velvety surface of mullein. These plants, with their generous size and soft texture, offered a comfort that must have felt like a small luxury in a world otherwise accustomed to rougher materials. Mullein, in particular, with its tall, spire-like stalks and large, felted leaves, was known in many parts of Europe as a plant of many uses. It could serve as lampwick, as a medicinal poultice, and for those in need as a gentle white. Burdock, with its expansive leaves, served much the same role. In damp woodlands, the moisture-rich leaves of butterbur or dock might be favored, offering a coolness that was especially welcome in the warmer months. Herbs sometimes served a dual purpose. In households that valued fragrance, or in monastic gardens where aromatic plants were cultivated for both medicinal and spiritual purposes, leaves of mint. Sage or thyme might be used for cleaning. The scent was no accident. In a world where foul odors were often unavoidable, any small effort to mask them was worth making. Even the humble nettle, dangerous when fresh but harmless once wilted, could be pressed into service if nothing better was at hand. The choice of greenery was often dictated by the season. Summer offered abundance, a living storehouse of soft foliage and flexible stems. In autumn, leaves grew tougher and began to curl, making them less pleasant to use. In winter, when greenery was scarce, other solutions were salt moss, straw, cloth scraps. Spring, with its flush of new growth, brought a return to comfort. Such rhythms became part of the unspoken knowledge passed down within households and villages: where to find the best leaves, when to gather them, and which plants to avoid entirely. The caution was real, for nature offered hazards alongside its gifts. Certain plants, like foxglove or poison ivy, though the latter was unknown in Europe, could cause rashes, irritation, or far worse. Medieval herbal lore, preserved in both oral tradition and written herbals, warned against using leaves from plants known to burn or blister the skin. In rural communities, this wisdom was as essential as knowing which berries were safe to eat or which mushrooms to avoid. In some places, plant material was stored for later use. Large, soft leaves might be gathered in late summer, dried in shaded, airy lofts, and kept in baskets near the latrine or chamber pot. Though they lost some of their softness when dried, they remained serviceable. The act of storing such leaves hints at a level of forethought that belies the common assumption of the medieval period as entirely improvised and unplanned. Leaves also played a role in the etiquette of rural life. In regions where communal latrines or open field defecation was practiced, it was considered polite, if such a word can be used in this context, to use and discard plant material away from common footpaths or water sources. In certain forests where hunters and woodcutters regularly spent days at a time, piles of moss and bundles of leaves were kept near camps, replenished as part of the camp's upkeep. We might imagine a late summer morning in a medieval hamlet. A woman, tending her small garden, notices the broad green leaves of dock growing by the fence. She plucks a few, setting them aside in a small basket already filled with herbs for the kitchen. Later, after visiting the wooden privy at the back of her property, she uses the dock leaves cool, pliant, and pleasantly smooth before discarding them in the waste pit. The act is entirely unremarkable to her, a moment's pause in a day filled with labor. And in this way, plants served as silent, ever-present helpers in the medieval household. Their role in personal hygiene may not be celebrated in illuminated manuscripts or epic poems, but it was real, practical, and deeply tied to the cycles of nature. In their quiet service, they remind us that in the Middle Ages, the boundaries between the natural world and the human world were thin indeed. The leaves that shaded the path, that wrapped the day's bread, or that healed a small wound might also play their part in the most private of moment-soft, green tokens of the earth's endless utility.
Winter is coming. You've heard the old song and known the truth since childhood, when the lush greenness of summer faded, when the frost laid its glassy hand upon the fields, and when even the moss turned brittle beneath its icy sheath. The medieval world was forced to turn to rougher materials for the necessities of cleanliness. In winter, comfort was sacrificed to practicality. And nowhere was this truth more evident than in the tools people used in place of toilet paper. No record survives of any medieval person sitting down with a stack of quilt, velvet, or linen as they read their book or reclined on a chaise lounge. Even the wealthy could not escape the laws of supply and demand. And during the colder months, soft materials were in short supply for this purpose, but several resources were at hand that could serve the same basic function. The most common of these cold weather substitutes was straw, harvested in the autumn and stowed in barns, lofts, or stuck in sheaves near the home. Straw was plentiful and easily gathered. Its stiff, hollow stalks were hardly gentle on the skin, but they were absorbent enough to serve the purpose for farmers and laborers. Straw was already at hand, part of the daily rhythm of tending livestock, bedding stalls, and thatching roofs. A handful could be taken without a thought, used quickly and discarded in the midden or waste pit. If you enjoyed this fact-filled journey through time and want to explore more historical tales, consider subscribing. Your support will ensure we can continue bringing history to life for you. Now, back to the topic at hand. Rural folk were not the only ones making do with what was available. While the very poorest might use whatever they had, including old rags or even the leaves of plants like stinging nettles or the prickly. Most people kept some kind of substitute for soft cloths aside for hygiene purposes. Urban dwellers might keep a supply of straw or hay near their latrines, just as their rural counterparts did. After all, even in a city, it was not uncommon for a family to keep a small flock of chickens or a rabbit or two, and caring for animals meant having some straw on hand. In some regions, especially in the colder climates of northern Europe, straw was not used in its loose form at all, but bundled or braided into short wads that could be gripped and controlled more. The process of twisting the stalks together softened their edges slightly, though it did little to remove their. Some households even kept small baskets beside the latrine, keeping a supply of these prepared bundles ready to grab and use. For those who could spare it, hacked earlier in the year and softer than straw, as an acceptable substitute. Hay was valuable as animal feed during the long months when pasture was scarce, and its use for hygiene would have been an indulgence reserved for necessity rather than habit. Still, for those who could spare it, hay was far gentler than the brittle, sometimes sharp stalks of straw, and in the deep chill of January, such small mercies mattered. The wintertime latrine experience was, by all accounts, an unpleasant one. In castles and monasteries, guardrobes built into the thick stone walls might be drafted to the point of cruelty, their openings admitting cold air as well as expelling waste. In rural cottages, the wooden privy or font, set at a distance from the main dwelling, required a trek through snow and mud, sometimes in the teeth of the wind. It is easy to imagine a villager hurrying across the yard with a bundle of straw in hand, eager to finish the business quickly and return to the warmth of the hearth. In some places, crude wooden seat might be set over a hole in the ground, offering a degree of shelter, but nothing more. In the harshest weather, when venturing outside was dangerous, chamber pots became essential. These ceramic, metal, or even wooden vessels could be kept indoors, allowing for a degree of comfort. Cleaning oneself after using such a pot might still involve straw, kept in a small container nearby, though in wealthier homes, soft cloths or moss stored from the warmer months might be used instead. The pot itself would be emptied into a designated pit or cesspool, sometimes by the household servants, sometimes by the occupants themselves, for the poor who might not have a privy or a chamber pot at all. The act was far more exposed. In open fields, along the edges of frozen streams, or behind windbreaks of brush, straw was the most dependable choice. It was the byproduct of their own labor, a thing so common as to be almost invisible in daily life, yet essential in this unglamorous task. Despite its roughness, straw had certain advantages. It was plentiful, disposable, and being dryless, likely to freeze in the biting cold and damp moss or leaves. In some communities, ash from the hearth was sprinkled over used straw before it was thrown into the midden heat, reducing odors and aiding in decomposition. This small act of domestic management, repeated countless times in countless homes, was a quiet testament to the practical intelligence that underpinned medieval rural life. Still, there is no romantic way to speak of the chill that must have met bare skin in the depths of winter. The stiff, scratchy feel of straw against cold flesh, the numb fingers fumbling with a bundle while breath steamed in the air. These were the realities behind the painted scenes of cozy hearts and feasting tables. This was the side of the Middle Ages that went unrecorded in courtly romances and illuminated manuscripts. But it was every bit as real as the tournaments, the hunts, and the pilgrimages. Winter hygiene was a compromise between what was possible and what was tolerable. Straw and hay, in all their rough simplicity, were the tools that made that compromise work. They were not pleasant, but they were reliable. And in a world where survival often depended on accepting discomfort, that reliability was enough.
In the medieval world, cloth was precious. Every thread represented labor flax grown, spun, and woven, wool shorn and carded, linen bleached in the sun, dyes extracted from plants or minerals. For most households, fabric was too valuable to be discarded lightly. Garments were mended until they could no longer hold a stitch, passed down through the family, and finally cut into smaller pieces for household uses. One of those uses rarely spoken of in polite company was as a tool for personal hygiene. Rags were in many ways a sign of thrift. They were the final stage in the life of a garment that had been worn, patched, and perhaps repurposed several times over. The coarse linen shirt that once served the father in the fields might, after years of wear, be turned into smaller tunics for children, then into strips for bandages or kitchen cloths, and finally into rags for cleaning the body. Even the finest fabrics, silks, and velvets worn in the courts of nobles would eventually lose their luster and find themselves in far humbler service. The quality of the cloth made a great difference. Fine linen, even when worn thin, could be surprisingly soft and gentle. Wool, by contrast, was often scratchy unless it had been fulled and worn smooth over many years. Coarse hemp, while durable, was rarely used for direct contact with skin unless nothing else was available. Households that could afford linen rags reserved them for personal cleaning, while rougher fabrics were kept for other chores. Rags had the advantage of being reusable. In many homes, especially in towns where water was easier to access, cloths could be washed and dried for repeated use. In rural villages, they might be rinsed in a stream or at the well, wrung out and hung to dry on a line or a low branch. This practice blurred the line between necessity and frugality. Reusing cloth meant not only saving resources, but also avoiding the constant need to gather fresh plant material or straw. Some medieval households kept a small box or chest in the latrine area specifically for rags. These might be cut into palm-sized squares, folded neatly, and stacked for use. In wealthier homes, such cloths could be scented with herbs, lavender, rosemary, or mint to mask odors. In poorer homes, the rags were simply kept dry and clean as best as circumstances allowed. Monastic communities sometimes formalized the use of cloth for personal hygiene. In abbeys where order and cleanliness were central to daily life, each monk might be allotted a set number of cloths per week, washed communally along with other linens. The rule of Saint Benedict did not dwell on such matters, but practical records from certain monasteries make it clear that hygiene, however plain, was a matter of communal management. The reuse of cloth was not without its hazards. Washing methods were often limited to cold or lukewarm water, sometimes with the addition of wood ash or lye soap. While these could remove visible dirt, they were far less effective against the unseen agents of disease. Still, in a world without germ theory, the visible cleanliness of a cloth was enough to render it safe in the eyes of the user. In times of scarcity war, famine, or plague rags became even more important. When food and fuel were dear, the idea of spending time and energy gathering moss or leaves was impractical, especially in winter. Old garments were cut down without hesitation, their fibers turned to the most basic of uses. In such times, there was no shame in the act. It was survival, plain and simple. There is a quiet dignity in the way these rags completed the life cycle of a garment. What had once shielded a body from cold, wind, and rain would, in its final service, tend to the body in a far more private way. The medieval mind was accustomed to such transformations, seeing no contradiction in using the remnants of a cloak for so intimate a purpose. It was a world without the wastefulness we know today, where even the smallest scrap found its place. We might picture a winter's evening in a modest stone cottage. A man, finishing his meal by the fire, pulls from a small basket a few squares of worn linen once part of his wife's apron folded neatly beside the hearth to keep them dry. Later, after stepping to the wooden privy outside, he will use them and rinse them in a bucket of water drawn from the well. Tomorrow, they will be hung on the line, and the cycle will continue. There is nothing remarkable in the act. It is part of the quiet, unending rhythm of life. The daily lives of people in the Middle Ages are often painted in broad strokes. Kings and queens, peasants and paupers, epic battles and plagues. But in the everyday details of medieval life, we can get a better understanding of the time. And sometimes that means learning about the rather intimate act of cleaning yourself. As it turns out, the medieval people had some pretty interesting tools for the job. While the wealthy could afford scented oils and soft cloths, the less fortunate had to make do with whatever they could find. And among the most surprising things they used were stones. Yep, you heard me right, stones. They might sound like an odd choice for cleaning, but they made sense in a rural pre-industrial world. Not only were stones readily available, they were reusable and, well, kind of necessary in a pinch. The practice of using stones for cleaning goes back much further than the Middle Ages. The Romans had a word for it, pessoi, which referred to small, smooth pebbles used for scrubbing. Archaeologists have found such stones in ancient latrines, some worn smooth from use, others deliberately shaped to fit the hand. The idea is not hard to grasp. A stone could be picked up, held in the palm, then used to scrape away anything that needed removing. Afterwards, it could be rinsed off, dried, and put away until next time. It's easy to see why this practice continued in some places even after the fall of the Roman Empire, especially since the empire's vast infrastructure of public baths and communal latrines did not survive the collapse. In the medieval period, stones chosen for hygiene were typically smooth river pebbles, their edges rounded by years of tumbling in the current. Flat stones were preferred over round ones for their ease of handling. These stones could be found along riverbanks, lake shores, or even plucked from plowed fields after the spring thaw. The appeal lay in their permanence. Unlike leaves or straw, a stone could be cleaned and reused indefinitely. Cleaning a stone was straightforward. In areas where water was plentiful, it might be rinsed in a bucket or stream after use. In drier climates, the stone could be wiped clean with cloth or straw and stored for next time. Some households kept a small collection of these stones near the latrine, often in a wooden box or a clay pot, ensuring they were always at hand. The use of stones wasn't universal, however. Pottery shards were also common, particularly those with worn, dull edges that would not cut the skin. A chipped cup or plate could be useful here, but care was taken to choose shards with smooth edges, as even a minor cut in such an area could lead to infection. Over time, the repeated handling and washing of the shard would wear down its edges further, making it safer and more comfortable to use. In both cases, the material was valued for its durability and the fact that it required no ongoing labor to procure once acquired. There was, however, an unspoken hierarchy in their use. Stones and shards were most often associated with the poor, with laborers, and with those living far from sources of softer materials. Among the wealthier classes, such methods might be seen as crude, even barbaric. Yet practicality often blurred such lines. On a journey or in a season when other resources ran short, even a noble might find himself reaching for a smooth pebble. The written records from this time also occasionally refer to the use of stones, though often in euphemistic terms. Monasteries, with their meticulous record-keeping, sometimes listed smooth pebbles for the garderobe alongside basins and water jugs in their inventories. Here, the choice may have been as much about order and cleanliness as about scarcity. Stones could be boiled or soaked in vinegar between uses, making them a more sanitary option than cloth rags in communities concerned with disease. Pottery shards, though more fragile, had their advantages. They were easily replaced, and once worn beyond use, they could simply be discarded without waste. In some places, discarded shards from pottery workshops were gathered for precisely this purpose, a byproduct of another trade finding a second life. In conclusion, the use of stones and pottery shards for cleaning during the Middle Ages might seem strange to us today. but it was a practical solution to a common problem in a time when resources were scarce and reuse was a necessity. These tools allowed people to maintain a basic level of hygiene without relying on soft, luxurious materials that were often prohibitively expensive. So the next time you reach for that bottle of fancy soap or that stack of soft towels, spare a thought for the medieval folks who made do with whatever they had, including stones. They might not have had the fanciest tools, but they certainly knew how to make the most of what they had. Thank you for watching. To the modern mind, the very idea of sharing not just a bathroom space, but the implements of personal hygiene is almost unthinkable. Yet for much of the medieval world, communal latrines were not only common, they were practical, economical, and deeply woven into the rhythms of life, whether in monasteries, castles, military camps, or bustling towns. They brought together the most private of acts into a shared, public setting. The medieval communal latrine was a far cry from the tiled public restroom of today. In many cases, it was a long wooden bench with evenly spaced openings built over a pit, a flowing water channel, or even directly over the edge of a river. In castles and monasteries, the garderobe might be constructed high in a tower wall, with multiple seats side by side and a vertical chute dropping waste into the moat or a cesspit below. In larger urban settings, public latrines were often little more than timber sheds built near water sources, sometimes with separate sections for men and women, but more often with little to no division at all. Privacy was minimal. Dividers, if present, were low, and conversation between users was not unheard of. The act of relieving oneself was regarded as part of life's necessities, unworthy of excessive shame. In military camps or on long pilgrimages, the communal aspect was even more pronounced. Men would sit together in open trenches, side by side, speaking of the day's events as they attended to nature's call. Where communal latrines existed, so too did communal cleaning tools. One of the most enduring examples was the shared sponge stick, a direct descendant of the Roman tersorium, kept in a bucket of water or vinegar solution. The sponge at the end of a wooden handle could be dipped, used, rinsed, and returned for the next person. This method, still in use in parts of Europe well into the later Middle Ages, was efficient and required fewer resources than supplying each user with individual cloths or plant matter. In other settings, the communal tool might be something less refined, a rope with frayed ends, hung in the water below the latrine platform so that the current would wash it continuously. The user would pull it up, use it, and drop it back down for the next person. Sailors employed a similar method aboard ships, with the rope trailing in the sea. While to modern eyes this might seem dangerously unsanitary, in the medieval understanding it was perfectly serviceable, the flowing water believed to carry away both dirt and disease. The shared nature of these tools required a degree of trust and mutual acceptance. Within monastic communities, this was perhaps easiest to maintain. Monks lived together under vows, sharing food, clothing, labor, and prayer. It followed naturally that they would also share in the necessities of the garderobe. Some monastic rules even included instructions for keeping the latrine clean and ensuring the sponge or cloths were properly rinsed. In castles, the arrangement was similar but less orderly. Servants and soldiers might use the same garderobe, their tools maintained by a designated attendant. Nobles often had private facilities, but in times of siege or travel, even they might be forced into shared arrangements. On a bitter winter's night, the warmth of a communal latrine built over a running sewer might even be welcome compared to the icy wind outside. Urban public latrines could be less pleasant affairs. Crowded, poorly maintained, and often frequented by people of every class, they were notorious for their smells. Yet even here, shared cleaning tools were not unusual. Buckets of water, bundles of straw, or rough cloths hung on pegs might be available for anyone to use, though their cleanliness depended entirely on the diligence of whoever managed the facility. We might picture a riverside town on a market day in the late 14th century. Merchants and farmers have gathered from miles around, the streets alive with shouting and the clatter of carts. Down by the quay, a public latrine stands on stilts above the flowing river, its wooden floor worn smooth by years of use. Inside, a row of open seats faces the water. A bucket sits in the corner, half filled with cloudy water in which a sponge stick rests. One man finishes, rinses the sponge, and returns it for the next. The exchange is wordless, unremarkable, and entirely ordinary to those present. For all their lack of privacy and hygiene by modern standards, communal latrines served an important role in medieval society. They concentrated waste disposal in one location, reducing contamination of wells and streets, and they allowed for the shared use of tools and materials that might otherwise have been scarce. They also reinforced the communal nature of medieval life where daily existence, from eating to sleeping to relieving oneself, was often lived in the presence of others. In the medieval world, the act of cleaning oneself was not merely a matter of practicality. It was shaped often subtly, sometimes overtly, by the great forces of religion and culture that governed daily life. Faith was not a separate sphere from the body. It reached into the most private corners of existence, dictating what was proper, what was forbidden, and even what materials one might use after relieving oneself. Christian Europe, bound together by the authority of the Church, inherited a complex legacy from both the ancient world and the teachings of Scripture. While the Bible itself offered no explicit instructions on post-relief hygiene, there were passages in the Old Testament drawn from Jewish law that spoke of cleanliness in connection to spiritual purity. Deuteronomy, for example, gave instructions for keeping the camp clean during times of war, including the burial of human waste. Though medieval Christians did not follow Jewish law in a literal sense, the association between bodily cleanliness and moral order lingered. In monasteries, cleanliness was often framed as a discipline of the body that reflected the discipline of the soul. The rule of Saint Benedict, though sparse on specifics, insisted on orderly living, which extended to the garderobe. Monastic records sometimes mention the use of certain materials over other soft cloths, moss, or even water perhaps, because they were considered more fitting for the body of one dedicated to God. Cleanliness here was not a matter of luxury, but of maintaining the vessel through which one served in prayer and labor. Pilgrimage, too, had its hygienic customs. Medieval pilgrims traveling long roads to Santiago, Canterbury, or Rome often passed through lands influenced by other faith traditions. In regions under Islamic rule or influence, such as Al-Andalus in Spain or the ports of the Mediterranean, travelers would have encountered water-based cleansing as the norm. Islam, with its emphasis on ritual purification, prescribed washing with water after relieving oneself, a practice known as istinja. To the Christian traveler, this might have seemed unfamiliar at first, yet practical and admirable, especially in warmer climates where water was readily available. Some brought this habit back with them, blending it into their own routines. Judaism, too, with its long tradition of ritual washing, influenced medieval urban life where Jewish communities thrived. In certain towns, Jewish and Christian households alike might draw water from the same wells or use similar washing jugs in the latrine. While the religious meanings behind the acts differed, the practical result greater attention to cleanliness crossed confessional boundaries. Superstition also played a role. In some parts of Europe, it was believed that the materials one used after relieving oneself could influence health and even fortune. Using certain plants, especially those associated with healing or protection like yarrow, sage, or rue was thought to ward off illness or evil spirits. Conversely, some avoided particular materials for fear of bringing misfortune, often because of old folktales linking them to disease or bad luck. Seasonal rituals occasionally touched on hygiene as well. In some rural communities, a springtime purification involved cleaning not only the home and the hearth, but also the latrine, replacing old cloths, moss, or plant matter with fresh supplies. The act was as much symbolic as practical a renewal of the household for the year ahead. The intersection of faith and hygiene could also be seen in times of plague. During outbreaks of the Black Death in the mid-14th century, many believed that foul air or miasma carried disease. Cleaning oneself after defecation became, in some cases, more careful and deliberate, especially among the wealthy. Who could afford cloths perfumed with rosemary, lavender, or vinegar-soaked sponges? These materials were not chosen only for their cleaning qualities, but because their scents were believed to protect against illness. Cultural exchange was perhaps the most powerful driver of change in these habits. The Crusades, trade routes, and the movements of scholars all brought Europeans into contact with the hygiene practices of Byzantium, the Islamic caliphates, and beyond. Water cleaning vessels, scented cloths, and even the idea of dedicated personal cleaning tools filtered slowly into Western Europe. By the late Middle Ages, some wealthy households kept fine brass or ceramic, Ibrick's narrow-spouted vessels designed specifically for washing the body after relieving oneself. Yet for all this variety, belief remained the quiet guide behind choice. A peasant in rural France might use handfuls of straw without a second thought, believing the earth provided what was necessary. A monk in an English abbey might dip a cloth in cold water each morning, seeing it as part of his devotion to orderliness. A merchant in Valencia, influenced by both Christian and Muslim customs, might keep a jug of rose-scented water beside the chamber pot, feeling both cleaner in body and safer in soul for its use. In the medieval mind, there was no neat separation between the physical and the spiritual. Cleanliness could be a preparation for prayer, a protection against disease, or a fulfillment of inherited custom. Even in the most private act, the weight of belief was present-shaping, not only how one cleaned oneself, but why. We've said it before, and we'll say it again. Do not use your phone while sitting on the porcelain throne. You never know what kind of interesting and potentially historical information you might miss. Like, for example, that the quaint piece of perforated paper you re-perched upon might have a cousin in a medieval cesspool. It turns out that toilet paper, like so many things, has a surprisingly ancient history. But how did people deal with the delicate task of cleaning themselves before the invention of modern conveniences? If you're a fan of the series Outlander, you've probably seen Claire use moss and spring leaves for hygienic purposes. And while that may seem shockingly gross to modern viewers, it turns out that what Claire is doing is actually pretty historically accurate. Welcome back to the channel. In the medieval world, the turning of the seasons was not merely a change in scenery. It was the great clock by which all life was measured. Crops were planted, harvested, or left fallow according to its hands. Food stores, fuel, clothing, and even travel were dictated by it. And so too, in a quiet, often overlooked way, was the matter of personal hygiene. The materials one used in place of toilet paper were rarely a fixed choice. They shifted as the year's wheel turned, each season offering its own possibilities and its own hardships. Spring brought a sudden abundance after the long scarcity of winter. The thaw released streams and rivers from their icy prisons, making water more available for washing. Moss, green and tender, reappeared on rocks and tree trunks. The first shoots of dock, burdock, and mullein pushed through the soil, their leaves soft and broad, perfect for cleaning. For rural households, spring was a time of renewal not only in the fields but also in the garderobe. The baskets beside the latrine, which had held straw or rags all winter, could now be replenished with fresh plant matter. Some even made a ritual of replacing the old with the new, as if casting off the discomforts of the cold months along with the last of the frost. Summer was the season of greatest comfort in this regard. Leaves were plentiful, soft, and at their full size. Moss was damp and thick in shaded woods. Water sources ran clear and full. In warmer climates, even those accustomed to using cloth might turn to water for cleansing, enjoying the cool relief it brought in the heat. In fishing villages, sea sponges, gathered during summer voyages, could be dried and stored for repeated use. The choice was often one of preference rather than necessity, and for a brief stretch of the year, comfort in this most private task was easily within reach. Autumn was the season of transition, and with it came preparation. As the days shortened and the air turned sharp, leaves grew coarser, their edges curling and their softness fading. In many rural communities, this was the time to gather and store what would be needed for the cold months ahead. Large, pliable leaves dock, mullein, butterbur were picked in quantity and dried in shaded lofts. Moss was collected and stored in cloth sacks, kept slightly damp to preserve its texture. Bundles of straw and hay were stacked near the latrine, ready to replace the dwindling stores of greenery. Those with means might set aside old garments to be cut into rags during the long winter evenings by the fire. Winter was the season of hardship in hygiene as in all else. Snow and frost made water harder to fetch. Greenery vanished from the land, and even moss could be too frozen to gather. Straw became the most common choice, its scratchy stalks a far cry from the soft leaves of summer. Rags were more valuable than ever, especially for households without animals to provide straw. Stones or pottery shards might be kept in warm corners of the home to prevent the shock of cold contact. For many, the privy itself was a trial set apart from the warmth of the hearth, its seat rimed with frost, its air biting. The act of cleaning oneself was as quick and utilitarian as possible, comfort sacrificed entirely to necessity. This seasonal rhythm meant that few medieval people used the same materials year-round. Instead, their habits were attuned to the land's offerings, shifting as naturally as the crops they planted or the clothes they wore. In this way, hygiene was yet another thread binding them to the natural world, their bodies and their most private routines moving in harmony with the great cycle of the year. We might imagine the life of a single peasant family through the seasons. In spring, the mother gathers young dock leaves from the garden's edge. In summer, the children fetch moss from the woods. In autumn, the father cuts straw from the field and stacks it in a dry shed. In winter, the family relies on those stored bundles, the rags from worn garments, and the frozen water from the well, thawed just enough to rinse. This was not unusual. It was the unbroken pattern of generations. In the medieval world, nothing was static, not even the way one cleaned oneself. The seasons decided and the people obeyed. If you enjoyed this video, you might enjoy our podcast. In it, we bring you new historical tales each week, as well as early access, exclusive content, and more. No road in the medieval world was ever straight, no bridge over river or marsh ever sturdy enough. Rivers changed course, bridges collapsed, whole sections of road could fall victim to flood or fire. And so the traveler had to be ready to make do with what the road offered him, whether he was a pilgrim walking to a shrine, a merchant with goods to sell, or a soldier on his way to a siege. What did the traveler do when he needed to wash himself? To answer this question, we have to consider the materials at hand. For most travelers, a small supply of cloth would be their first resource. A bit of linen or a soft woolen cloth that they could fold and carry until needed. Cloth might be cut into squares to divide the water into smaller portions, or it might be wrapped around the hand like a glove to apply soap. These cloths might be washed, hung up to dry on a nearby tree or bush, or even boiled with their owner's meager dishwater. When cloth failed, the resourceful traveler would look for natural materials that could take its place, and there were many options to choose from. In the damp meadows of northern France, pilgrims to Santiago de Compostela reported finding plenty of moss and broad leaves. Crossing into the drier lands of Spain, they might stuff handfuls of straw into a cloth sack, tying it off to form a makeshift sponge. Small, smooth stones were also useful, wrapped in a cloth or simply held in the hand. They could be used to scrape the skin, remove dirt, or even dispense a small amount of soap. Water was often the traveler's biggest problem. Wells were few and far between, and most travelers couldn't carry enough water to sustain them on a journey, and so they had to make do with whatever water they could find. A puddle might do in a pinch, but many people, especially pilgrims, avoided standing water for fear of bad airs rising from it. This didn't mean they were above bathing in streams or even rivers, just that they were careful to heat their water first. Those without boiling water took a chance on surface water, though even these folks sometimes used a strainer made of cloth or a folded paper towel to catch larger insects and other debris. A knight on campaign or a sailor on a Mediterranean galley had a different sort of access to water. While they might not have the luxury of wells or streams, the ships and camps typically had large containers of water for drinking and washing. Though how clean these really were can be debated. Military camps frequently boasted latrines, which could be dug easily enough in the soft earth of most campsites. These were usually little more than shallow trenches lined with straw. Once filled, they were covered over and the process started again. At times, there was little thought given to privacy, with multiple men sharing a single latrine. When nature called in the middle of a long march, soldiers had to make do with whatever vegetation was at hand. soft plant material was a fortunate find. When none was available, the traveler might seek out a clump of nettles or pull down a low bush. Nettles were preferable after they had been crushed by the feet of marching men, as the oil in the plant was dispersed throughout the leaf, so the sting was less intense. Whatever materials the traveler used, the experience itself was unpleasant. Nettles or no, care had to be taken to protect the skin from the worst of the irritation. Bramble bush, therefore, were avoided entirely. Not only were their thorns unpleasant, their sap was known to intensify the pain caused by contact with stinging nettles. Scholars and envoys often had the easiest experience. Traveling between universities, monasteries, and courts, they were more likely to be lodged in guest houses. Monasteries or the homes of fellow learned men where basic hygiene was better maintained. Even so, a long road between cities meant improvisation. University clerks and lawyers traveling between Paris and Bologna, for instance, might carry a small pouch of dried moss gathered the summer before. In the end, whether on the road or at home, the traveler had to be prepared to improvise. To that end, one learned to scan the roadside for dock leaves or gather moss in shaded gullies. Even a couple of smooth stones in a pouch could come in handy. Those with experience knew what to avoid, like brambles and freshly crushed nettles. Most of all, they knew to take advantage of nature's bounty when it was available. A good patch of moss might be collected and kept in a small cloth sack, dampened at a stream when needed. A long journey meant separation from home comforts, but it could also mean encountering other cultures. When a Genoese merchant watched a Syrian wash himself with a brass vessel, he took note. Perhaps months later, back in Genoa, he purchased a similar vessel for his own use. Over time, such practices spread slowly, influencing the hygiene customs of distant regions. This has been Medieval Hygiene in a minute. If you want to learn more about medieval hygiene, check out the series in the description below. Please subscribe and leave a like. And as always, thanks for watching. Did you know that during the Middle Ages, people didn't use toilet paper? Well, if you were a peasant, you wouldn't have used anything soft. You would have used whatever you could find lying around. For peasants, men, women, and children, hygiene was about function, not comfort. They needed something to wipe with, so they used straw, hay, moss, or leaves. They gathered these from fields, hedgerows, or riverbanks. If you were lucky enough to live near a forest, you may have even used moss. This material was highly sought after because it was soft and spongy, but your choice of hygiene tool would depend on what was available and what you could carry. Now, rags were used when available, but very few garments were thrown away. Clothing was mended and patched until it was almost unrecognizable. So it's safe to say that no one really got fresh underwear in the Middle Ages. However, if you were a peasant town dweller, you probably had better access to cloth scraps than your rural counterpart. This is especially true if you lived in a household connected to the textile trades. Weavers, for example, had access to offcuts of linen or wool that could be used in a pinch. These cloths could be washed and used again. Straw and leaves were still common, especially in colder months, but having cloth on hand made for a bit more comfort. You may have also had access to a public latrine or shared a water closet with your neighbors. This would have made cleaning yourself up a little easier. You could perhaps hang a bundle of straw outside your home or keep one in a bucket, as well as a bucket of water or cloths managed by an attendant. Now, this was far from luxurious, but it was a step up from having nothing. If you were a wealthy merchant, you may have encountered new ideas while traveling. You may have even gotten to experience a bit of luxury. At inns along your trade route, you could wash your hands and face with linens, sometimes scented with herbs or rosewater. In the Mediterranean, you could have purchased a sponge on a stick. These were made with a netted pouch filled with a rough sponge and a handle made of wood or bone. These were expensive, but they were prized for their softness and reusability. You may have also seen or used water-based cleansing methods. This could include using a metal or ceramic container such as a basin or e-brick for washing after using the chamber pot. Once you experienced this convenience, it was hard to go back. So if you returned to your hometown without a servant to wash your behind for you, you might use the next best thing, a communal cleaning tool. Many cities had public latrines and some had public baths. If you were lucky enough to live near one, you could hang a bundle of straw or cloths on a nearby hook. In the royal court, personal hygiene took on a new meaning. It became a way to display wealth and power. Kings, queens, dukes, and other nobles were attended by servants, who ensured that they were always clean and ready to make an entrance. Attendants would have fine linen squares for their nobles, and these would only be used once before being taken away and cleaned. Some accounts say that these cloths were stored in carved wooden chests lined with herbs to impart a pleasant scent. When traveling, nobles would bring a portable version of their bathroom experience with them. They would have a portable commode and a wooden chest containing linen squares and a sponge stick. The sponge stick would have a handle carved from ivory or fine wood and a sponge tied to the end of it. The sponge would be replaced periodically. A lady-in-waiting might have been tasked with carrying this equipment as well as a small water jug. Now, hygiene was not always a comfortable or convenient experience for anyone, but if you were a noble, it was certainly a hygienic one. You may have even believed it to be healthy. The nobility enjoyed greater access to resources and goods, and this was reflected in the quality of life in the privy. In fact, for the upper classes, hygiene could have become a kind of game. Each season brought different materials to work with, and it was expected that people would experiment and enjoy the finer things in life. In this way, hygiene became a status symbol. The further you were removed from the peasant experience, the softer your linens and the more exotic your cleansing tools. So whether you were using a humble sponge on a stick or a rough piece of straw, everyone had to answer nature's call. But in the Middle Ages, the means by which they answered varied greatly depending on their social class. Thanks for watching. When we think of medieval castles, we usually imagine a stone keep, a drawbridge, and perhaps a portcullis. But what comes to mind less often are the quotidian concerns of people living and working there, including where they put their, For many of us, trips to the bathroom are so routine they're almost subconscious. We flush the toilet and go about our business barely thinking about it. But our porcelain thrones are a recent invention. And for centuries, people in medieval Europe relieved themselves in very different ways. And inside the thick stone walls of a medieval castle, hygiene was shaped as much by architecture and defense as by comfort. A fortress was not built for convenience, but to endure attack. So a toilet was an afterthought at best, and the result was interesting. To say the least, a fortress was not built for convenience, but to endure attack. So a toilet was an afterthought at best, and the result was, to say the least, interesting. A castle's latrines, known as garderobes, were designed to get rid of human waste as quickly as possible, both for reasons of health and of smell. No one wanted to linger around a castle bathroom if they could help it. Still, some measure of privacy and order was possible in a castle compared to the outside world. Built into the outer walls, they projected outward in stone or timber shafts, their waste dropping into the moat or a cesspit below. Some fortresses had garderobes on multiple floors, each serving a different section of the castle. Nobles enjoyed private facilities near their chambers. Soldiers and servants used larger, shared garderobes near the kitchens or barracks. Cleaning materials varied depending on a person's status. Nobles might have baskets of linen squares or soft moss, while the garrison relied on straw, rags, or even smooth stones kept in a nearby bucket. But during a siege, the rhythms of life changed completely. Supplies of fresh material, cloth, moss, or even straw could run dangerously low. Trade and travel stopped, and everything had to be rationed. In some castles, linen rags were washed and reused far more often than in peacetime, sometimes boiled in large cauldrons with lye soap to make them last. When cloth was scarce, everyone, from noble to servant, turned to whatever was available, old clothing cut into strips, bundles of straw from the stables, or dried leaves stored from the previous autumn. Water was another challenge. Castles under siege often relied on wells within their walls. But water was precious, especially if the attackers tried to poison it or cut off its access. This meant washing after relieving oneself could become a luxury. In such cases, dry cleaning methods using straw, rags, or stones were preferred. Water was reserved for drinking and cooking. In desperate times, even these methods could become strained, forcing people to reuse materials more often than they would in normal conditions. The waste disposal system itself could also become a problem. In some castles, garderobe chutes emptied directly into the moat. During siege conditions, when waste could not be flushed away by running water, the moat could become foul and stagnant, a breeding ground for disease. Attackers sometimes exploited this, catapulting carcasses or waste back over the walls to worsen the smell and spread sickness. The stench could make the simple act of using the garderobe nearly unbearable, especially in the heat of summer. In these conditions, hygiene was not only a matter of comfort, it could become a matter of morale and survival. A disciplined garrison might assign specific people to maintain the garderobes, ensuring that waste was shoveled from cesspits or that cleaning materials were kept dry and accessible. Monastic castles, such as those held by military orders, sometimes enforced strict rules for latrine maintenance, seeing cleanliness as part of military discipline. There are accounts from certain sieges, though rarely detailed, that hint at the ingenuity of defenders. One 5th-10th century chronicler noted that during a siege in the Low Countries, the garrison boiled cloth scraps to soften them before use, both to make them more comfortable and to disinfect them. Another story tells of defenders gathering moss from the castle gardens, drying it in the sun and storing it in sacks to stretch their supplies. These details, small though they seem, reveal the unseen struggle that ran parallel to the fighting on the walls. When the siege ended, whether in victory or surrender, the garderobes and latrines were often in a sorry state. Cesspits had to be emptied, chutes scrubbed or rebuilt, and supplies of rags, straw, and water restored. The return to peacetime hygiene was a relief in more ways than one. Thanks for watching. We talk about the toilets of ancient Rome, but what did the toilets of medieval monasteries look like? What were they like? Well, sit down. Yes, you're going to want to hear this one. Welcome to Life Noggin. Within the quiet stone walls of a medieval monastery, life followed a rhythm as precise as the tolling of the bells. Every day was divided into sacred hours matins, lauds, prime terce, sext. None, vespers, and compline, and between these hours, monks and nuns worked, ate, studied, and slept. Yet woven into this rhythm were the unavoidable necessities of the body, and these too were managed with the same order, care, and discipline that governed all other aspects of monastic existence. The medieval monastery was a place where spiritual purity and physical cleanliness were intertwined, even if not in the modern hygienic sense. Dirt, disorder, and foul smells were not merely unpleasant. They were disruptions to the atmosphere of calm and order required for a life devoted to God. Thus, the facilities for relieving oneself and the methods of cleaning afterward were carefully integrated into the daily structure of life. The necessarium, the communal monastic latrine, was often a surprisingly sophisticated structure for its time. In the largest and wealthiest abbeys, such as those of the Cistercian order, the necessarium could be a long stone or timber building, fitted with a row of seats set over a continuous flow of water. This water, often diverted from a nearby stream or spring, carried waste away, reducing foul odors and allowing for more regular use without the labor of emptying pits. In smaller monasteries, the latrine might simply be a bench with holes over a pit, but even then, the location was chosen for convenience and cleanliness, often downwind and slightly apart from the living quarters. Cleanliness after relieving oneself was seen not only as a physical necessity, but as part of maintaining the orderliness of monastic life. In most monasteries, the common method was to use soft cloths cut from worn linen garments. The abbey's tailors and weavers, when producing new garments, would eventually set aside pieces of cloth that had grown too thin or frayed for wear. These would be cut into small squares or strips, washed, and kept near the necessarium in a covered chest to protect them from dust and damp. Water for washing was common in well-endowed monasteries, particularly those influenced by Mediterranean or Islamic practices through travel and trade. Clay or metal ewers might be kept in the necessarium, allowing monks to rinse themselves directly. In some cases, there were small channels of running water built beside the seating area, ensuring a constant supply for cleansing. Where water was scarce, the monks relied more heavily on cloths, moss, or even soft-dried leaves, gathered in the warmer months and stored for winter use. Sponges mounted on wooden sticks, a practice inherited from Roman tradition, were also used in some monasteries. These were often communal tools, kept in a jar of vinegar or brine when not in use. The vinegar was believed to purify and deodorize, and while modern science would find this only partially effective, it was an early attempt at sanitation. The care of these sponges, like the laundering of cloths, fell to designated monks, often under the supervision of the celerarius or the infirmarius, the monk responsible for health and provisions. Routine was essential. Certain times of the day naturally saw heavier use of the necessarium after meals, after the morning's manual labor, and before retiring for the night. Because monastic life emphasized silence, these visits were usually wordless affairs. Yet despite the silence, there was a shared understanding of the importance of keeping the space tidy for the next user. It was common for monasteries to assign specific days for cleaning the latrines, with tasks rotating among the brothers or sisters. Differences existed between male and female houses. In convents, the facilities were often smaller, serving fewer people, but the same principles applied. Wealthy nunneries sometimes stored cloths with sprigs of lavender, rosemary, or mint, making the experience more pleasant. Poorer convents made do with moss, straw, or rags, washed and reused until they wore away. Hardship tested these systems. In times of scarcity, whether due to famine, siege, or illness, cloth supplies could dwindle. Monks might be forced to use moss or straw exclusively, and water for washing could be rationed. Yet the records from certain houses show that even under strain, the effort to maintain cleanliness was rarely abandoned. This was partly practical. Disease could devastate a close-knit community, but also spiritual. Disorder in the care of the body was seen as a step toward disorder in the care of the soul. For novices, instruction in monastic life sometimes included the proper use of the necessarium. This was not considered trivial. A monk or nun was expected to care for their tools, keep the space clean, and ensure that what they used was properly washed or disposed of. The humility required to take part in such maintenance was seen as part of the path to holiness. Imagine a Benedictine abbey in early spring. The air is cool, and a faint mist clings to the cloister garden. After lauds, some of the monks file quietly toward the necessarium, a long building of timber with a running water channel beneath it. A wooden chest in the corner holds folded linen cloths, and beside it stands a glazed ceramic jar containing a vinegar-soaked sponge stick. One monk takes a cloth. Another chooses the sponge, each replacing their tools when finished. Outside, a laundry monk collects the soiled cloths, carrying them to the washhouse where they will be boiled in a great cauldron before being returned for use. It is a scene without grandeur, without ceremony, yet it reveals the essence of monastic discipline. The same care that governed the chanting of the Psalms, or the copying of a sacred text, was applied here to the humble business of keeping the body clean. For in the cloister, nothing was too small to be done well, and even the most private acts were bound to the shared life of the community. Did you learn nothing? New facts every day? Welcome to my channel. Life aboard a medieval ship was a study in confinement. The vessel might be a coastal cog hugging the shoreline of the North Sea, a sleek Venetian galley darting across the Mediterranean, or a broad, deep-bellied carrack bound for distant ports. Whatever its form, the conditions were cramped, the quarters damp, and the space for privacy non-existent. For sailors, merchants, and passengers alike, the matter of relieving oneself and cleaning afterward was dictated by the unyielding realities of the sea. On most ships, there was no enclosed toilet in the modern sense. Instead, the crew relied on the head, a simple opening at the bow of the ship, often a wooden platform with a hole cut into it, extending out over the water. Here, the waste fell directly into the sea. The location was practical. The constant spray of waves helped rinse the platform, and the prevailing wind carried odors away from the deck. Passengers, if the vessel carried them, sometimes had access to a small, partially screened area near the stern, but the arrangement was far from private. Cleaning oneself after using the head required improvisation. The most common method for sailors was the tow raga length of rope trailing in the water behind the ship. When needed, a sailor would haul in the rope, use its wet fibers for cleaning, and then drop it back into the sea to rinse. This method, crude as it might seem, had the advantage of constant washing by the ocean itself. On larger ships, particularly those making long voyages, tow rags might be designated for specific group's crew, officers, or passengers to maintain a semblance of hygiene. In calmer seas, some sailors preferred to use handfuls of seawater directly, leaning from the platform or using a small bucket dipped over the side. Buckets were also the solution in rough weather when the head was too dangerous to use. In such cases, a bucket might be kept in a sheltered corner of the deck to be emptied overboard when conditions allowed. This was an unpleasant but necessary compromise, especially in storms when venturing to the bow could mean being swept into the sea. For passengers on merchant ships, particularly wealthy merchants or pilgrims, more refined methods were sometimes employed. Those who could afford it might bring a small chest containing cloths, moss, or even a sponge for personal use. Some Mediterranean traders carried ceramic washing vessels, allowing for water-based cleansing even in the middle of the voyage. These luxuries, however, required a steady supply of fresh water, which was always limited at sea and carefully rationed. Water was one of the most precious commodities aboard ship. Rainwater collected in barrels might be reserved for drinking and cooking, leaving little for washing. Salt water, abundant but harsh on the skin, was the standard for cleansing after relieving oneself. Over time, frequent use of salt water could cause chafing and discomfort, especially in cold or windy weather. To combat this, some sailors used soft rags or moss when available, washing them in seawater and drying them in the rigging. The constraints of shipboard hygiene were most severe on long voyages. Crews could be at sea for weeks without sight of land, relying entirely on what they carried aboard. Supplies of cloth or moss were quickly exhausted, making the tow rag or seawater bucket the only realistic options. The constant dampness of the sea air meant that nothing stayed dry for long, and mildew could quickly overtake stored cloths, making them unpleasant to use. Smell was an inevitable part of ship life. The head, though rinsed by the sea, could still carry the stench of waste, particularly in hot weather or when the ship lay becalmed. Buckets used during storms were worse, and their contents had to be disposed of promptly to avoid foul odors permeating the lower decks. In some cases, sailors sprinkled vinegar or herbs over the head or bucket to mask the smell of small comfort in the close quarters of a crowded ship. Despite these limitations, seafaring cultures developed habits to maintain at least a minimal standard of hygiene. On Mediterranean galleys, where crews often came from lands familiar with water-based cleansing, jugs of seawater or diluted vinegar might be kept specifically for personal washing. In the north, sailors relied more heavily on rope and rag methods, making the most of the tools and materials at hand. The challenges of hygiene at sea were shared by all aboard, from captain to deckhand. Rank might influence sleeping quarters or rations, but the sea made no concessions for status when it came to bodily needs. Even the wealthiest merchant, sailing to the Levant with a hold full of spices, might find himself leaning over the head in a stiff wind, cleaning himself with a tow rag like the humblest sailor. Warfare in the Middle Ages was dirty, smelly business, fought and dirty. But while we think of medieval battles as the clash of steel and the roar of angry men, they were also a test of logistics. For weeks or even months at a time, thousands of men, women and children lived shoulder to shoulder in close, crowded conditions. When an army encamped, one of the first tasks was the digging of latrine pits, long trenches dug at a distance from the main camp, downwind and ideally near a stream or ravine for drainage. The purpose was simple: don't let the camp become foul and disease-ridden. To maintain order in the latrines and the rest of the camp was a sign of a good and professional army. In some armies, such as those led by experienced commanders or influenced by Roman military manuals, strict orders were given on where and how these pits were to be dug. The depth, length, and width of the latrines varied according to the level of sophistication of the army using them. In more disciplined forces, soldiers were expected to carry a small personal kit for hygiene cloth scraps, a water flask, perhaps a smooth stone or two. Among the more professional troops, such as the knights of the military orders or certain mercenary companies, there was an understanding that maintaining cleanliness was a part of staying combat ready. Sickness and sores from neglect could cripple a fighting force as surely as enemy arrows. But in less disciplined or more desperate situations, soldiers might relieve themselves wherever they could, leading to foul smells, polluted water sources, and outbreaks of disease. Dysentery was a common scourge of medieval armies, often doing more damage than enemy swords. Chronicles from the Crusades, the 100 Years' War, and other campaigns are filled with grim references to sickness sweeping through camps, made worse by bad sanitation. Cleaning materials in the field depended on what the land offered. Soldiers used straw, grass, or leaves when available. In wetter climates, moss was prized for its softness and absorbency. Smooth stones were also common, especially in regions with little vegetation. Rags cut from worn clothing were a luxury, often reserved for higher-ranking officers or for those who had prepared supplies before the campaign. Washing with water was possible if a stream or river was nearby, but in many cases fresh water was reserved for drinking and cooking. Camp followers, women who cooked, washed clothes, and tended to the wounded played an important role in maintaining hygiene. They collected cloth scraps, boiled water, and sometimes even prepared bundles of moss or straw for use in the latrines. In large encampments, these followers often set up near the edge of the camp where the waste pits were located, ensuring that soiled materials were disposed of properly. Siege warfare brought special challenges. Armies might be camped in one place for weeks or months, and the surrounding land quickly became stripped of vegetation, leaving little for personal cleaning. Waste pits could overflow, attracting flies and fouling the air. In such conditions, soldiers often had to reuse cloths, washing them in whatever water could be spared. The stench of a siege camp, combined with the smoke from cooking fires and the ever-present smell of horses, could be overpowering. Even in battle, soldiers had to contend with these needs. A knight in full armor, mounted and ready for combat, could hardly leave the line to find a private place. Accounts from the period suggest that in moments of urgency, soldiers sometimes relieved themselves where they stood, cleaning afterward only when the fighting allowed. Such moments were not spoken of openly, but were understood as part of the brutal reality of war. In the end, medieval military hygiene was a matter of practicality over comfort. Soldiers used whatever they could find, often in harsh and unsanitary conditions. Yet even in the most desperate circumstances, the need to clean oneself remained a universal instinct, a small act of personal dignity amid the chaos and brutality of war. This is a series about medieval life. Catch all of our episodes right here. In the icy grip of winter, as biting winds swept across the lands, the availability of soft materials for personal hygiene purposes took a nosedive. In northern Europe, during the winter months, the ground was often buried under a thick blanket of snow, making it difficult to locate the soft moss or broad leaves that were commonly used as cleaning materials. And when the rivers froze over, the supply of water-based solutions became limited. Consequently, people turned to whatever materials they had at hand, such as straw or hay, which were often stored in barns or stables. These materials, although not as pleasant to use, served the purpose and were readily available during the winter months. However, they did have their drawbacks. Straw, for instance, could be quite rough and scratchy, leading to discomfort, especially during the cold weather when skin was already dry and sensitive. It required careful usage to avoid causing any irritation or injury. Additionally, the type of material used could vary depending on the specific region and the resources available. In colder climates, where water was scarce and hard to access, people might rely more on cloth or linen scraps, which could be washed and reused. When spring arrived and the ice thawed, water-based cleaning methods made a comeback. People would use moss or broad leaves, which grew abundantly during this season, as well as water from newly unfrozen streams and ponds. The shift from dry to water-based cleaning methods mirrored the change in seasons and the availability of resources. As we journey through the Mediterranean, we encounter a starkly different set of challenges. Here, water was not as scarce, but the availability of green cleaning materials varied throughout the year. In the heart of summer, when plants were wilted and dried out under the scorching sun, the options for water-based cleaning were limited. Instead, the people of the Mediterranean turned to smooth pebbles, which were abundant along the coast and riverbanks. These pebbles, worn smooth by the constant flow of water, were easy to clean and reuse, making them ideal for personal hygiene practices. The hot, dry climate encouraged the use of water for washing, even during the summer months. Proximity to water sources and the need to stay cool in the heat contributed to this habit. However, in the face of prolonged droughts, water scarcity could impact these practices, forcing people to rely on dry cleaning methods. During such times, they would turn to materials like cloth or reeds, which were more readily available in the dry season. Despite the challenges posed by the climate, the Mediterranean regions had a rich variety of plants suitable for cleaning purposes. During the winter and spring, when plants were lush and green, people had a wide range of materials to choose from. Moss, which grew abundantly in shady, moist areas, was a popular choice. Its soft, spongy texture made it ideal for cleaning delicate areas. Broad leaves, such as those from fig or bay trees, were also widely used. Their smooth surface and flexibility made them easy to clean with water, a common practice in the Mediterranean. In conclusion, medieval hygiene habits were not just about personal cleanliness, but a testament to human adaptability in the face of diverse climates and geographies. As we reflect on these historical practices, it's important to remember that they were shaped by the unique challenges and opportunities presented by each region. Whether it was the freezing winters of Northern Europe, the sweltering summers of the Mediterranean, or the scorching heat of the desert, people developed practical and resourceful solutions to maintain cleanliness using whatever materials were available to them. A little over 700 years ago, a devastating plague struck England, killing perhaps half the country's population. It happened again a couple decades later, and then again a couple centuries after that. And every time it hit, the people of the period had to figure out how to keep going while terrified of an invisible killer that lurked around every corner. In ordinary times, hygiene was guided by habit, climate, and social standing. But when illness swept through a town, castle, or monastery, those habits often shifted, sometimes becoming stricter in the hope of avoiding contagion, sometimes collapsing entirely under the weight of fear and desperation. And with bubonic plague striking again and again throughout history, people came up with a variety of ways of coping, both practical and otherwise, to understand what life was like during a plague outbreak. Let's take a closer look at what people did and didn't do when they needed to relieve themselves. Let's start with the year 1348, when the Black Death arrived in England on the appropriately named Mayflower. At the time, the most terrifying thing about the disease was how mysterious it was. Victims suffered from painful swellings, fever, chills, weakness, vomiting, diarrhea, and often died within a week or two. Though we now know that these symptoms were caused by bacteria carried on fleas living on rats, medieval people had no idea where the illness came from or how it spread. But they did notice that foul smells seemed to be involved somehow. This wasn't unusual. Throughout history, people have associated bad smells with disease and death, and the Black Death was no exception. People believed that foul smells carried disease, a concept known as miasma, and so keeping waste under control seemed more urgent. In wealthy households, garderobes and chamber pots were emptied more often, and lime was sprinkled in cesspits to suppress odor. But the practicalities of cleaning oneself were difficult during a plague. If your town was under quarantine, as was often the case with plague-stricken cities, the movement of goods in and out was restricted, so supplies of linen cloth or moss could dwindle. In these cases, households that normally used soft cloth might find themselves reverting to rougher, more readily available materials: straw, dried leaves, or even smooth stones. Water for washing was sometimes avoided altogether, especially if it came from public wells, since it might carry disease. In those cases, dry cleaning methods became more common, even in regions where water rinsing was the norm. The impact of the plague also depended on where you lived. In hospitals and plague houses, where the sick were gathered for care, hygiene was a constant challenge. Attendants and nurses, aware of the dangers of foul odors, often burned sage, rosemary, or juniper near the latrines in an effort to counteract the smells. Cloths for cleaning patients were sometimes soaked in vinegar, which was believed to purify and ward off sickness. sponges, if used, were likewise kept in vinegar or wine. While these measures offered little protection against actual contagion, they were thought to create a barrier between the body and the deadly air. Monasteries, often tasked with caring for the sick during plagues, had to adapt their strict routines accordingly. In times of plague, the necessarium or bathroom might be cleaned more frequently, with cloths boiled in water, infused with herbs before reuse. Some monastic records mention the disposal of cloths entirely after contact with the sick, an expensive but deliberate choice to reduce the risk of spreading illness. In poorer houses where cloth was too precious to throw away, boiling and vinegar soaking were the only defenses available. Fear of contagion also influenced social distance and hygiene. In shared facilities, whether a castle garderobe, a monastic latrine, or a public privy, people began to avoid sitting near others or touching communal tools. In some cities, wooden partitions were added between seats in public latrines during outbreaks. Communal sponge sticks, once rinsed between uses, were abandoned in favor of personal cleaning materials, even if they were crude. The psychology of plague also shaped private behavior. In rural households, people often relieved themselves in isolated spots far from home, burying waste immediately to avoid the smell lingering near the living quarters. In cities, chamber pots became more common, allowing people to avoid public facilities altogether. The pots were emptied carefully, sometimes with lime thrown over the contents before disposal. Siege and plague together were a deadly combination. Armies camped outside city walls could be struck by sickness just as easily as those inside. And with fewer resources for sanitation, the effects were often worse. Soldiers might be ordered to relieve themselves far from camp. But in practice, crowded conditions and constant watch duties made this impossible. It's hard to overstate how much medieval conceptions of hygiene were shaped by the plague. Every action took on a new dimension of risk. Keeping things clean became a matter of urgency, fear, and desperation. And yet, for all the limitations of their understanding, medieval people were already groping toward the principles of sanitation. They sprinkled lime, burned herbs, soaked cloths in vinegar, and avoided shared tools. None of it was based on understanding bacteria, but it all helped stave off the spread of disease. It is the year 1439. You are a prosperous merchant living in the town of Bruges, and you have just relieved yourself in your garderobe, a privy built into the thick outer wall of your house. What do you do next? If you are thinking of grabbing a sheet of rough linen to wipe yourself with, you would not be far off. But if you are expecting merchants to use the equivalent of toilet paper, you are sorely mistaken. In this time and place, there is no such thing as disposable bathroom tissue. Instead, our merchant reaches for a small stack of soft linen squares kept beside the garderobe, squares that are used and then laundered. Though the precise details of hygiene varied across medieval Europe, one thing was constant: the avoidance of anything disposable in the bathroom. No one, regardless of status, would dream of using a leaf or a stone to clean oneself. At best, such things might be used to, well, do the job, but they were never clean, and they certainly weren't reused. The poorest might share a rough cloth with family or neighbors, but even that was considered a sign of great poverty. You see, in the medieval mind, cleanliness was never simply a matter of removing dirt. It was a moral and spiritual concept tied to ideas of purity, order, and discipline. How a person cared for their body right down to the private act of cleaning after relieving themselves was seen, in certain circles, as a reflection of their inner state. Even when hygiene was dictated by necessity, it carried with it a weight of symbolism shaped by religion, custom, and social ideals. For most medieval Europeans, religion formed the foundation of their understanding of cleanliness. In Christian thought, physical purity was often linked to spiritual purity, though the connection was complex. The Church did not teach that one's soul was cleansed by washing the body, but monastic rules and moral writings emphasized the value of orderliness and self-discipline, including in bodily matters. Filth, excess was seen not only as a danger to health, but as a mark of neglect, a sign that one's life was disordered, perhaps even morally lax. In the cloister, this link between body and soul was particularly strong. Monks and nuns followed rules that governed not only prayer and work, but also the care of communal spaces, including the necessarium. Cleanliness was part of obedience. To leave the latrine untidy or the cloths unwashed was to fail in one's duties. The humble act of cleaning oneself after relieving the body became an extension of the greater work of keeping the self both physical and spiritual ready for service to God. Beyond the monastery, symbolic associations also influenced how people thought about hygiene. Medieval medical theory, rooted in the writings of Galen and expanded by Arabic scholars like Avicenna, taught that the body's balance of humors could be upset by foul odors and unclean surroundings. Waste, with its smell and corruption, was thought to generate bad air, miasma, that could affect not only the body, but also the mind. Thus, disposing of it properly and keeping oneself clean afterward was part of maintaining the harmony of one's whole being. In some regions, traditions blended Christian and older folk beliefs. Among rural communities in parts of Germany and the British Isles, it was considered unlucky to neglect cleaning oneself after relieving nature, as lingering filth was thought to invite illness or even spiritual harm. Stories circulated of spirits or fairies who might trouble those who failed to keep their bodies in order, turning a simple hygienic habit into a small act of superstition-driven self-preservation. Social standing also played a role in how cleanliness was perceived. Nobles and wealthy townsfolk often made a point of using finer materials, soft linen cloth, moss scented with herbs, or sponges rinsed in wine or rosewater, not only for comfort but also as a sign of refinement. Such habits reinforced the idea that cleanliness was a mark of civility and status. The poor, who made do with straw, leaves, or stones, were often viewed as living in rougher, less ordered conditions, though their habits were shaped entirely by necessity. The symbolic link between hygiene and order extended even into architecture. In castles, the placement of guardrobes was a mark of planning and sophistication, integrating sanitation into the structure rather than leaving it as an afterthought. In towns with public latrines, the maintenance or neglect of these spaces could become a visible reflection of civic pride or decay. A well-kept privy was a sign that the community cared for itself. A foul one, a sign of disorder. Religion also shaped more intimate habits. While medieval Christianity did not require water cleansing as Islam did, Christian pilgrims traveling through Islamic lands often adopted the practice temporarily, finding it both practical and symbolically purifying. In some cases, returning pilgrims brought these habits home, blending them with local customs. Likewise, Jews in medieval Europe maintained Netalet Yadayim ritual hand-washing, which, while primarily symbolic, often coincided with moments of bodily care, reinforcing the association between hygiene and sanctity. In everyday life, these beliefs meant that even the smallest acts of cleaning were imbued with meaning. A knight on campaign, wiping himself with a piece of linen and then burning it in the campfire, might be thinking less of comfort than of discipline, preserving his readiness for the next day's march. A village woman, dipping a rag into scented water before use, might be following a habit taught by her mother as much for its freshness as for its supposed protection from illness. Now, imagine a morning in a merchant's townhouse in Bruges. The family guardrobe, built into the outer wall, has a small basket of folded linen squares. Beside it is a jar of lavender water, used sparingly to dampen the cloth before cleaning. To the merchant and his household, this is not merely indulgence, it is an affirmation of their place in the social order, their commitment to living properly. The act is mundane, but it is also part of a daily ritual of keeping life in order, both physically and symbolically. In this way, medieval hygiene was never purely functional. It was shaped by an intricate web of beliefs, medical, religious, and social, that gave weight and meaning to acts we might now see as routine. Even something as simple as what one used instead of toilet paper could carry echoes of purity, discipline, and the human desire to find order in the most private corners of life. For more on medieval life, stay tuned. In the medieval world, even the most private acts were shaped by the realities of economy and trade. What people used instead of toilet paper depended not only on climate or culture, but also on what they could afford, what they could obtain, and how supply chains connected their homes to the wider world. Hygiene, like everything else in the Middle Ages, was bound up with the great web of commerce, scarcity, and local production. For the wealthy, the choices were broad and often luxurious. Linen, the most prized cloth for personal cleaning, was costly to produce. Flax had to be grown, harvested, retted, spun, and woven, a process that required time, skill, and labor. For this reason, linen was not used casually by most people. It was a sign of refinement and wealth. In noble households and wealthy merchant homes, scraps of worn linen garments were cut into neat squares and kept for private use. Even here, waste was avoided. Cloths were washed and reused until they became too frayed, at which point they might be burned for fuel or discarded entirely. The poor rarely had the luxury of cloth for such purposes. In rural areas, they relied on what the land offered freely: moss, grass, straw, or leaves. These materials had no direct cost beyond the labor of gathering them, but even these could be scarce in certain seasons. In winter, when vegetation was dead or buried under snow, households stored sacks of dried moss or straw collected in warmer months. In times of famine, when every scrap of straw was needed for livestock bedding or thatching, people might resort to using smooth stones, clumps of earth, or even handfuls of sand. Trade could influence hygiene in surprising ways. In coastal towns, especially in the Mediterranean, sponges were imported from warmer waters and became a favored cleaning tool among those who could afford them. These sponges, when soaked in vinegar or scented water, were considered both practical and pleasant. In Northern Europe, such imports were rarer and expensive, so their use was generally limited to the elite. Similarly, herbs like rosemary, lavender, and mint used to scent cloths or water were not equally available everywhere. In regions where they did not grow naturally, they had to be purchased from apothecaries or herb merchants, making them another marker of wealth. The scent itself became a subtle sign of status. A cloth carrying the fragrance of imported herbs hinted at connections to distant trade routes. Economic disruptions could have immediate effects on hygiene. During sieges, when supply lines were cut, even the wealthy might be forced to use rougher materials. Siege accounts tell of nobles and commoners alike resorting to straw, leaves, or rags torn from bedding when finer cloth was no longer available. Similarly, in times of plague, when fear of contagion made the reuse of cloth risky, the demand for disposable materials rose sharply, further straining supply. Urban centers had their own challenges. While trade brought goods into cities, population density meant that resources were quickly consumed. Public latrines were often stocked with communal cleaning tools, such as sponge sticks or bundles of straw, but the quality varied widely depending on the city's wealth and organization. In prosperous trading hubs like Venice or Bruges, the public facilities might be regularly maintained with fresh materials supplied. In poorer towns, users might have to bring their own or improvise with whatever could be found. The economics of hygiene also tied into labor. Laundering cloths for reuse was not a small task. In large households, servants were assigned to wash and boil cleaning cloths, often using precious fuel and soap. In monasteries, this labor was part of the community's routine, carried out by designated brothers or sisters. In poorer homes, laundering was done less often, and cloths were reused longer between washes. Not always by choice, but because firewood, soap, and labor were all in short supply. The market for certain materials even created small industries. Moss gatherers in rural areas, sponge divers in coastal waters, and herb sellers in urban markets all played a part in supplying the means of medieval cleanliness. A merchant returning from the Mediterranean with a crate of natural sea sponges could expect to sell them for a high price in northern ports. Likewise, a peddler carrying sacks of dried lavender from Provence might find eager buyers among the urban elite of Paris or London. We can picture 3 different households, each shaped by economics. In a nobleman's castle, the garderobe holds a wooden chest lined with fine linen cloths, scented with lavender. A servant, tasked with their care, collects them daily to be boiled and dried for reuse. In a merchant's townhouse, linen scraps are used sparingly, alternating with bundles of soft moss purchased from a market vendor. The moss, gathered from forests outside the city, costs a few coins each week, a manageable but noticeable expense. In a peasant's cottage, a sack of straw by the corner serves both for animal bedding and personal cleaning. When supplies run low in winter, smooth river stones become the default choice, rinsed in a bucket of cold water before reuse. In each case, the act is the same, but the materials and the experience are determined entirely by the household's place in the economic order. Hygiene, in this sense, was not just a personal matter. It was an intimate reflection of wealth, trade, and the flow of goods in the medieval world. Thanks for watching. The lack of toilet paper in the Middle Ages is a question that has captured the imaginations of many. You've probably seen countless videos and articles tackling this very query. But the reality of the situation is so much more fascinating than you might imagine. When we think of medieval Europe, we tend to conjure up images of filth and disease, of overflowing sewage systems and streets littered with waste. While some of that is true, it's important to remember that the Middle Ages spanned over 1,000 years and encompassed not just Europe, but the entire world. To understand how people dealt with their bathroom needs during this time, we need to take a closer look at the various regions and cultures of the medieval world. Let us start in the cold north, where winters could last for months and temperatures would plummet far below freezing. During the summer, people would gather moss that had grown on trees and rocks and dry it in the sun. These moss pads were then stored in sacks for use during the winter when cleaning oneself with water was impossible. In sacks, they were soft enough to serve as makeshift toilet paper. The moss itself had antibacterial properties and was considered quite sanitary. In more prosperous times, linen cloth was often used instead. When available, linen was a practical choice because it was soft, absorbent, and washable. When not in use, the linen squares were washed and boiled to sterilize them, making them suitable for reuse. This practice was not unique to the medieval period, and similar methods were used as early as the Roman Empire and even today in areas without modern sanitation. But what about the common folk who couldn't afford linen or moss? For the rural poor, life was more difficult and cleaning materials were often in short supply. During the winter months, when water froze solid, people would use straw or smooth stones to wipe themselves clean. Straw was readily available in most households and provided a rough but functional surface. Smooth stones were also popular, especially in areas where water was scarce. They were durable, easy to clean, and could be reused multiple times. As the seasons changed, so did the materials used for cleaning. In the spring and summer, when plants were abundant, broad oak, hazel, or ivy leaves served as a suitable replacement for toilet paper. These leaves were soft and flexible, making them comfortable to use. Meanwhile, in the winter, people relied on moss, straw, or whatever other materials they had stored from the previous year. In the temperate heartlands of Europe, there was more variety to work with. People had access to a wider range of plants and materials, including hemp, flax, and even the feathers of geese. These materials were used alongside moss and straw, depending on the season and availability. However, despite the differences in materials, the methods of cleaning remained largely the same throughout medieval Europe. Regardless of what was used, the act of cleaning oneself after using the outhouse or privy was a common practice among all social classes. Interestingly, in the sunlit Mediterranean, the sea itself became a resource for cleaning. The smooth pebbles found on Mediterranean beaches were highly valued for their softness and durability. These pebbles were used repeatedly for cleaning purposes and were considered a luxury item in some areas. In fact, the importance of these pebbles was so great that they were sometimes imported from other regions, such as the Levant, where similar stones were plentiful. Furthermore, the Mediterranean climate allowed for year-round rinsing with water, unlike the northern regions where freezing temperatures made it impossible. Sponges were another popular cleaning tool in the Mediterranean, particularly in areas influenced by Romang and Islamic cultures. While the Mediterranean climate and water availability influenced hygiene practices, trade also played a significant role. Trade routes brought new materials and products to medieval Europe, such as spices, incense, and cleaning agents from the Middle East, and luxury items like ivory and scented oils from Africa and the Americas. These exotic goods were often used by the wealthy to enhance their personal hygiene routines. Despite the differences in materials and methods, one truth runs through every setting and circumstance. Medieval people, like people everywhere, found a way to solve this most basic problem. Their solutions were shaped by the land, the seasons, their beliefs, trade, and the need to adapt to changing circumstances. Even in the face of adversity and disease, they improvised, demonstrating the ingenuity and resilience of medieval people around the world. This topic is vast and complex, encompassing history, geography, culture, and daily life in the Middle Ages. We encourage you to dive deeper into this fascinating subject. Explore the various aspects and share your findings with us. Your insights and experiences will enrich our community and bring us closer to understanding the rich tapestry of medieval life. So go forth, fellow learners, and may your discoveries bring you closer to the heart of the Middle Ages.